Good afternoon. My name is Jody Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the Dutchess County Commission on Human Rights, and I want to welcome you here today to our webinar, Human Rights Past to Present, the Living Legacy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I want to first thank our partners in this project, the Eleanor Roosevelt Center and the New York State Division of Human Rights. We are very excited to be offering this program today and to have two phenomenal speakers, guest speakers, who I will introduce in just a minute. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to just mention what we'll be doing in our hour together today. Well, first, we will take a look at a short video to give some context and background about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Eleanor Roosevelt's leadership. As many of you know, she made her home here in Dutchess County, so we feel incredibly privileged to do this work here. Once we've taken a look at the video, I will introduce our speakers, and then they are going to have a conversation about the impact of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, literally on the world, how it's influenced the UN and many, many nation states around the world. So with that, we're going to take a look at a short video titled "Everyone Has the Right."
What are human rights? Are those rights the same everywhere? For everyone? For generations, we struggled with these questions. Then Eleanor Roosevelt and the United Nations set out to answer them.
Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world.
As we emerged from World War II, a conflict that killed tens of millions and left millions more with nowhere to go, Eleanor Roosevelt became chairperson of the newly formed United Nations Commission on Human Rights. We won the war, she said. Now we need to work to win the peace.
Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security.
She saw the possibility for international standards for human rights in the post-war world, but also the need to act quickly as Cold War tensions grew between the United States and Soviet Union.
Everyone has the right to freedom of thought and religion.
18 countries took part in the first Commission on Human Rights. They sent experts on law, legislation, religion, and philosophy who asked questions like, what are human rights? What is personhood? And what comes first, the rights of the individual or the interest of the community?
Everyone has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty.
With so many different backgrounds and beliefs in the room, finding common ground proved difficult. Eleanor Roosevelt needed all of her diplomatic skill to keep the group making progress. Meeting after meeting, for over 2 years, they hammered out 7 drafts of the new document. And like any good diplomat, she knew that often the toughest problems get resolved outside the room.
Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression.
When the United Nations General Assembly voted on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in December 1948, not a single nation opposed it. The room applauded Eleanor Roosevelt, who smiled while she famously continued her knitting.
Everyone has the right to peaceful assembly.
Since the Declaration passed, critics have argued that it's idealistic because it's non-binding, that it forces Western ideas on the world as a new form of colonialism, and that the great powers manipulate it for purposes of propaganda, all while repression of freedoms and atrocities still make the news.
Everyone has the right to seek asylum from persecution.
but the Declaration has profoundly impacted human rights worldwide, influencing the language of national constitutions, laws, and more than 70 human rights treaties. Eleanor Roosevelt called it a living document, part of an ongoing effort throughout our lives and the lives of our children to improve human rights.
Everyone has the right to education.
It's through our own education that each generation can answer the question, what are human rights? And continue to advance them for everyone. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, we have to decide whether it's worth the effort, and that requires character and courage and conviction.
Fitting that here tonight should be the person who's been the leader in this movement, assisted though she has been by many others, the person who was raised to even greater honour, so great a name. I refer, of course, to Mrs. Roosevelt, the delegate of the United States.
Okay, so thank you to the New York State Division of Human Rights for playing that video for us. We thought that would be a nice way to, again, give some background and opening to this conversation today. We have two amazing guest speakers who are going to enter into a conversation about the UDHR, as we call it, as it's known. And then we're going to have some time for Q&A, questions and answers. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A in the question box or in the chat. And once we get to the Q&A part, we will we'll be having a representative from the Division of Human Rights provide those questions to us. So first, I'd like to introduce Anna Eleanor Fierst. Anna is a great-granddaughter of Eleanor Roosevelt and the daughter of Mrs. Roosevelt's oldest grandchild, Eleanor Roosevelt Seagraves. Anna has a professional background in publication editing and marketing and managed the communications department at the Women's National Democratic Club before becoming its president in 2013. Upon retiring from that official role and just before the pandemic, she joined the board of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center to promote the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Her main goal now is to modernize one of ERVK's legacy programs and build programming support for this and a bold new endeavor, the annual Bravery in Literature Award. A native of New York State and Washington, D.C., Anna currently serves as the vice chair of the National Women's Foundation, an organization that promotes women's history, youth voting, and civic engagement. She and her husband raised two children in Bethesda, Maryland. So welcome, Eleanor. And our second guest today is Jessica Neuwirth, an international women's rights lawyer and activist. She is one of the founders of Equality Now, an international women's rights organization established in 1992, and the founder and director of Frontline Women's Fund, an offshoot project now hosted by the Sisterhood, is Global Institute to support women's rights organizations around the world. As a guest lecturer, Jessica has taught international women's rights at Harvard Law School and has worked for Amnesty International. She holds a Juris Doctorate degree from Harvard Law School and a BA in history from Yale University. Welcome, Jessica. And so I'm going to turn it over to Anna and Jessica to begin their conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Jody, for that introduction. We have a few questions here. We'll just take turns, and I'm going to throw the first question out to Jessica. What were the main challenges to gaining consensus for the key members of the drafting committee? And if you maybe explain for a second what the drafting committee was. How did cultural diversity complicate the process of gaining this consensus?
Thank you, Anna. And let me just start by thanking all the sponsors who put this together. And it's such an honor to be with you. Um, I, uh, I think I forgot to put in my bio maybe the most important part, which is that I run the human rights program here at Roosevelt House, which is, I know that it was said that the Roosevelts were from Dutchess County, but they also had a townhouse here in New York City. And that is where I am talking to you from. And as you could see, maybe I have a picture that I hold very dear behind me of Eleanor Roosevelt with her UN headphones at the UN during this process. And it's really such a privilege and inspiration for me to work here and be in her home. I think her vibe is in the air and is with us. So so to the questions, I think of course Mrs. Roosevelt was a great diplomat, and you could see the tribute that was paid to her in the video when they did adopt the Declaration of Human Rights. The process, as you might expect from the UN, was always a little bit complicated. So there was a Human Rights Commission that she chaired, and they did a draft. And the short story is that after, I think, a few years of negotiation, they finalized that draft. It was sent to the General Assembly for a vote, and the piece in the video that you saw where she was thanked was the adoption on December 10th, 1948 by the full General Assembly of the Declaration of Human Rights. In terms of the challenges, there were many, even though there were fewer countries at the time, and not all of the 48 countries were represented on the commission. I think it was just 18 countries. And they were from all over the world. There were several women, including Eleanor Roosevelt. And one thing I've done is pull out a few quotes from Eleanor Roosevelt herself, who wrote, as you may know, a journal called My Day pretty much every day for decades, with her reflections, what she had done. And during the time that she was negotiating this, she wrote in My Day. And then for decades after, she was often invited to anniversary events for the Declaration of Human Rights, so she would comment on that as well. So I'm going to just start by reading you what she said, which is one of the questions I'm most frequently asked is how difficult it was to produce a draft on which the Eastern European group and the United States could agree. I always thought this quite possible. But yes, the differences in the economic systems in the various countries brought us long lectures from the Eastern European group time and again. The Slavic bloc never failed to tell us of their success in housing, medical care, full employment, and security of the individual, generally from the economic point of view. And that highlights, I think, one of the main tensions in the drafting process, which was that between economic and social rights on the one hand, championed by the Eastern Bloc she's referring to, and civil and political rights on the other hand, championed by the Western Bloc that we know better. Another column, she reflected on this as well. On one occasion, the delegate from Lebanon pointed out that we might have full employment and be housed and fed and clothed well, but still, if we were not allowed as individuals to think freely and to speak freely, we would have lost some of the most essential freedoms cherished by man. These freedoms, however, do not loom very important when a man's stomach is empty. Man must first be fed before he can begin to think of freedom in its wider sense. One of the things that emerged for me out of our differences was the realization that time will have to bring us to a more equal standard of living. Until we do away with hunger and unnecessary disease and dire poverty throughout the world, real freedom will not exist. That is why each of us in our own country should be working to continue the fights for the rights of man on every level, spiritual and social, as well as economic. All kinds of rights are tied together. If we fail to grant only one of them, we will find ourselves failing to achieve the full measure of human rights and freedoms, the goal we desire to attain. So I read that long piece because just to give you the sense of not only the debate, which was as much or more, I think, than an ideological debate than a cultural debate about this economic and social rights versus civil and political rights. And again, as this master diplomat, but also in her own thinking, the way she expressed it herself, I think she realized, which many do, and the Declaration does, there's an interdependence of these rights. It's a bit artificial, I think, to try to create a hierarchy of which is more important, food or freedom. of the sorts that they're discussing. So those were great tensions. In terms of cultural diversity, you could see in the video too, they scratched out men and they put women. I don't know if that's cultural or universal, maybe, but definitely something that I think we owe to the women on the committee. It was the delegate from India who had proposed that instead of all men, it should be all human beings. And in so many other documents that we deal with from that time, and even sometimes today, you don't see that kind of universality. So that is a great tribute to them and forward-looking. And I think that in terms of the culture, there's one article too, which talks about all of the distinctions that we're not considering for entitlement to rights and freedoms: race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, social origin, property, birth, or other status. So it's a very broad article that applies to the entire declaration. And I think that it really set the stage, the Declaration of Human Rights, for everything that flowed from them. The UN was quite new, and to have that, I think, was really significant in many ways. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I just also want to point out that in the San Francisco conference, which Eleanor did not attend in 1945, but one of the initial stumbling blocks, and we talked a little bit about political rights here, is that the women from countries where, especially the countries where they did not have the right to vote, there was a real sense that they needed to press more strongly and more assertively for getting in the rights of women, because they were in a position, these women who were basically disenfranchised, they said, we have no voice in our countries where we come from. And it was Hansa Mehta, you mentioned the Indian woman, who actually just basically chased down Eleanor in the hallway and said, if you say that all men are equal to, that's literally how it's going to be interpreted in my country. And so there was this, I think, an interesting awareness and growth experience for Eleanor to see how women in these countries that really their rights were extremely limited, and especially the South American bloc of women, and later on as they went to Geneva and things progressed, the South American bloc of women were actually ardent feminists. And they were very, very assertive about making sure that there was nothing in there that would trample on their rights. So it was an eye-opener, I think, for American women, and also women from the UK were not as ardently, they were somewhat opposed to some of the language that women, especially from South America and South Asia, were proposing. So that's terrific. I really
just one addition to that, since you mentioned it, is, to this day, the UN has never had a woman serving as Secretary General. And I've been in many meetings right now. We've just started yesterday the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which happens every year. Right. There's more and more women like Eleanor Roosevelt now at high levels of the UN. The president of the General Assembly is a woman from Germany. And they all desperately would like to see a woman be the Secretary General after 80 years of the UN history. So there's a lot of discussion going on about that, and we're hopeful that
Are we close at all? Are we close to, in terms of last few decades, have we come close to electing or nominating?
Nominating, yes. Electing, no. I think
last
time there were quite a number of women candidates. And it's a very non-transparent process. It's like the election of the Pope in some ways. You just, behind the doors of the Security Council, there's a lot of negotiation, and the way the process works, the Security Council has to approve a candidate, then sent to the General Assembly for a vote. So no woman has come that close, but there have been women nominated for decades, and I think there is a very strong interest this year. We just have no idea with the politics of the world these days, how that will play out.
Yeah. So I just want to transition a little bit to how, we have the UDHR created in 1948, and then we were moving through the 50s and 60s. And I think in that time period, I get the sense that there were a lot of covenants that had to be established, basically growing out of, this is the foundational document, the UDHR, and what came out of that in terms of successive covenants that strengthened and in some ways made binding covenants. So this evolution process, I think, is fascinating.
Well, like many processes in the UN, although this was one of the first ones, you start with a declaration, and a declaration gets passed, and it sets forth basic principles, and then it's translated into a treaty, which is a more binding document that has much more specific provisions about what governments are really obligated to do once they accede to those treaties. So in the same way, or maybe it was the very first of its kind, the Declaration of Human Rights, there was originally envisioned that there would be a treaty, and it would be called the Human Rights Treaty. And early on, I mentioned before, the tension between the economic and social rights and the civil and political rights. Early on, there was just too much disagreement. And of course, they didn't have the benefit of Eleanor Roosevelt's chairing. That process fell apart, and we ended up with two covenants. One, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and one, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So they separated them into two covenants, which allowed some countries, like the United States, for example, to ratify only one of them. So we've ratified civil and political rights, but not economic, social, and cultural rights. And it was sad for someone like me who believes in the interdependence, as Eleanor did, of these rights. But it was part of the Cold War dynamic that was going on in the UN. And that's the way that evolved. There are a number of other treaties, too, that have definitely been inspired by particular provisions of the Declaration of Human Rights. So, for example, the prohibition on torture led to a declaration against torture and a convention against torture. We mentioned women. The provisions in the Declaration on Women led to a convention on the elimination of discrimination against, of all forms of discrimination against women, which is often referred to as CEDAW. There is a racial discrimination treaty called CERD, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And then there are a number of regional treaties as well. There's the European Convention on Human Rights. There's the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. There's an American Convention on Human Rights. One really significant thing about all of these treaties is that they have much more than the declaration, some kind of a monitoring and enforcement, not strong enforcement that's very effective, to be honest, but for example, all of those regional treaties have courts associated with them, which hear cases, make decisions. The treaties in the UN don't tend to have courts, but they have committees. So the committee, the CEDAW committee, for example, they all meet 2 or 3 times a year. Every government that is part of the treaty is obligated to report to them on how they've complied with the treaty, and experts are elected from around the world to review those reports, ask them questions, and then come up with conclusions or recommendations that become part of the official record. And then some of the treaties have other provisions for special inquiries or other forms of inquisition when there are violations. Again, nothing like a court that has enforcement mechanisms, but at least you get some jurisprudence and an opportunity to have those discussions with governments in a formal structure, which has grown much more elaborate over the years. And I just, I have to point out, I think one thing that was very sad for Eleanor Roosevelt, who one of her most famous quotes is something to the effect of "Human rights begins at home." She felt very strongly about that, and in fact, she often hesitated criticizing other governments because she felt that was a bit pretentious, or it was a bit presumptuous when we had so many issues in our own country. But I do think that we have to remember that, sad as it is, because especially she played such a leading role on behalf of our country in setting international human rights standards, that the U.S. has not ratified many of these treaties that flowed. So I mentioned the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights we have ratified, not the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, not this Women's Convention, which is the CEDAW Convention, which is known as the Women's Bill of Rights, the International
And I
Bill
think
of Rights.
let me stop you. I think the CEDAW has come up for ratification. I mean, it's come up multiple times, giving the U.S. opportunities to also sign on to that, and we've failed every time, right?
Well, President Carter actually signed it, but the process is 2 steps. So you have to sign the thing, and then that's the executive. It gets sent to the Senate, and you have to have a 2/3 vote of the Senate to approve the ratification. It's come up many times in the Senate, but it's never passed.
It never quite passes the 2/3 mark.
And
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and it's been ratified by almost every other country in the world, which is also true for the Children's Rights Convention.
Right.
I think just 1 or 2 countries haven't.
So speaking of children's rights, I do remember when back in the day when Britain was part, and this would have been going back to the maybe 60s or 70s, and this is the European Court of Human Rights, which grew out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which actually produces case law. And I do recall it's interesting that the UK at some point, for example, as a result of rulings, I think, from the European Court of Human Rights, prohibited corporal punishment in schools. So, and then there were other things, that I was reading about that came out of the basically fundamental. There was one that came out of this, I think, that prohibited the death penalty. So there were some really interesting structural elements that came out of that convention, which was a provided binding resolutions in front of the European Court. So,
Absolutely.
it is amazing. So the other thing is getting back to the non-binding binding issue, and we all know that UDHR is in that former category. How would you define the growth of the UDHR's moral authority in our Western society? What would you say the impact of that is in terms of the long sort of trail that we have gone down since 1948?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately moral authority is the main thing that we have, even with the treaties. There's a big legal debate about, are these declarations binding in some lesser way?
Yeah.
But even the treaties, people say they're binding, but there's no enforcement mechanism really.
Right.
So if you get what you want in terms of some kind of finding or recommendation, you then what? So what we have in the human rights movement is really what I think people call the mobilization of shame. That's based on moral authority, and the more concrete you have in a treaty, maybe you get a little bit more bang for the mobilization process. But I think the declaration is so simple, and so elegant that it also has its own level of moral authority. And in terms of its impact, I just want to briefly quote Eleanor Roosevelt herself, who said in one of the anniversaries that she was asked to speak at, "I would like to correct a misapprehension which seems to have arisen from something I must have written or said in the recent past. Specifically, I was told the other day that I did not think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 10th anniversary of which we are celebrating this year, has been successful. Actually, I believe this declaration has had enormous moral impact on the world, and that it has succeeded far beyond our expectations." So I think her own view, which is encouraging, is that it did have an impact. And I think how it has an impact is in giving people that sense of, we all have these rights. It's universal. Right. It doesn't matter what my laws and my government, they're all saying I don't have these rights, but I know I have these rights. And I think, she also was very clear about that. It's important to stand up for these rights. And this is one of those documents you can wave around and say, look, here are my rights. They've been endorsed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I've seen that in the most remote villages in South Africa where people suddenly understand this, and it's a tool. And I think it can be very effective.
Right. And it's funny, there's two things here. One is in terms of the moral authority. I just wanted to add that there's been, and I've talked to various educators who are deep in the field and in the mission of providing K through 12 education on the subject of human rights. And I know that this is something we're going to cover next week with Dutchess County more, but I think that's an incredibly important tool that this UDHR has provided to educators, that this is a way you break this down. It's very easy to break it down and make it as a kindergartner can understand a lot of these things. So that is, in terms of internalizing, I guess is the best word, the concepts that are here and incorporating that, building lessons that really are around the morality of human rights and their essential human dignity. That's really the strength there, because kids grow up then with this as a notion of this is what I deserve. This, and the funny thing is I've been reading a book by, it's kind of my Bible on the UDHR, by the book by Marianne Glendon. And she talks about the fact that the South African delegate got very upset about the concept, and they had a huge argument about the word dignity. And he was not, and he says, not everybody is entitled to full dignity. And finally, they got back and the man, the president or whatever, Smuts was his name, of South Africa, had actually said, no, I think we need to do this. He backed down, but there was this, it was an interesting thing. And I just want to say, in terms of, it took 2 years, but when you think of this, they had a long discussion about one word, which is key to the whole concept behind human rights, that we are all deserving of equal levels of dignity. And then everything flows from that down to its components. But I thought that was quite interesting.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I just want to say, in terms of the goals for, and I know you have a background in Amnesty International, what rights do you see out there, both in the Western world and developing worlds? Where do you see, in terms of where we're at right now, what are the rights of human rights that are most at risk?
I mean, it's very sad to say that asking me this question now versus maybe 5 or 10 years ago, it's not going all in the right direction, because you want to feel like we're building a human rights world. And I think for the most part, historically, we have, and we continue to in some ways, but there's certainly been so much backsliding that it's really hard to say. I mean, obviously, in this country, we're facing a lot of challenges in terms of freedom of expression. And in terms of questions of political asylum, where I think there's, people being sent away who have pending claims of political asylum. And then just this idea of free and equal and dignity and rights. That's a global problem, I think, that we've seen. And there are many provisions, or a number of provisions in the Declaration, that talk about self-determination effectively. The idea that people should be able to take part in elections, and democracy is, very fragile around the world. And I think we just have to be concerned about all of these questions.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just one other thing. I'm talking a lot about civil and political rights, but then also I think the standard of living, which is something that's very well, covered in the Declaration of Human Rights, is another concern. We have more, more of a gap, I think, in terms of the wealth in the world, and people just living in dire poverty. And that standard of living doesn't really meet the requirements of the Declaration.
Yeah, I was, getting back to that, looking at sort of what I would say. I got back, and I'm familiar, with all the articles. I just sometimes remember which number belongs to which one. But Article 19, and kind of getting back to your point, Jessica, about the right. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right, and I feel like it's stated in rather modern terms, this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. And I can, you can understand when you read through, some of them are fairly non-controversial. You can see where the Soviet bloc would have just signed off on them, and others where, and we'll get to that later, about sort of what we consider the most radical article in all the 31s, and we each have our sort of our favorite. But that one, I think, is in terms of risks now around the world. I mean, people cannot freely and actually have a choice in their governments. I don't see how we're going to, civil society is going to continue to break down. So one thing, in your experience, in other areas, what were the important areas that were not addressed by the drafting committee? I mean, as I've gone through the articles, I sometimes think, well, this wasn't tackled because it did not exist as a problem, or it was too controversial. I mean, for example, the word they talked about the dissolution of marriage, in the one dealing with family, and the creation of families and so forth. And that was actually quite a bit of a hump to get over, because it looked like it encouraged divorce. So in conservative societies, that would obviously have been a problem. So what do you think in terms of if you were to go back, let me ask you this, and say, what's missing here? If you were to add on another article, let's put it that way, what would you add on? or
I mean,
redraw?
it's a very fun exercise. I think certainly there are issues that have come up now that just weren't as visible then. So obviously, climate change is one where we're all concerned about the impact, or some of us are concerned about the impact of climate change. And that's something that affects a lot of the rights that are in the Declaration. But on its own, I think, the right to an environment that's safe for people is one. And then one of the other ones that it's not new, but it wasn't really there, but people debated a lot, is the kind of right to peace. If I could add something, I think I would add the right to peace. And there was a parallel process going on. The Genocide Convention was being drafted. There's been a whole history of that following up, and criminal law has developed. This wasn't really meant to be a criminal law process. So there was an intentionality of keeping that separate. But I think the right to peace is at that level of generality that it would have been a good one to include.
Right. And that actually goes back to the four freedoms. I mean, that was a freedom from fear was one of the four freedoms. And that really gets right back to your point about having the right to peace, because then so I would be remiss because I realized I skipped over a question. We were going to talk a little bit about how human rights is affected by social media. And how social media is, in my opinion, as it comes to human rights and the sustaining of them, a double-edged sword. And there have been, I mean, I came across a horrifying example, for example, in South Sudan. I'm not sure when this was, within the last 10 years, a father auctioned off his 16-year-old daughter on Facebook. And Facebook, it was well publicized. Facebook came under a lot of pressure. But I don't think there's enough attention paid to the fact that these great sort of media empires, which you call Facebook and Meta, they are privatized now. So I mean, there's no sort of trickle down effect. Everybody has their other means of getting information. But what do yes, the Arab Spring, we can talk about that. There's certainly some really Black Lives Matter. There's some amazing trends and movements that came out of this, but there's so much manipulation going on now.
I mean, it's one of those issues that changes all the time because things are evolving so quickly. I was proud to be one of the first people on email, and now I'm kind of a snail in the past. But I try to follow this because I think from an advocacy point of view, nothing could be more important than social media. And like you said, there's the Arab Spring. Right now, we look at Iran, and of course, the counter where governments try to shut down access to the internet because it is such a powerful tool of communication that just anything we had before just pales in comparison. So I think it's one of those things, like you said, a double-edged sword. It has tremendous potential, both for good and for bad. And it really is up to us how we make it work, for human rights instead of against human rights. But I think on balance, it has to be a plus. That's my feeling.
Yeah. And the other thing is sort of looking ahead. I had an interesting experience. So I was sort of researching some of the more granular details here. And I would ask, just type it into my search engine. AI comes up oftentimes with a very bland, it is completely sort of soft pedals, like the issue I just talked about the domination by a few companies of major social media outlets. It doesn't mention any of that, and I think that is kind of going to be another danger here to look at. So I think you're right. Everybody just has to pay attention to this. You mentioned briefly the Genocide Convention that came up. I'm a little confused in my own mind as to when that came up in terms of its parallel to the UDHR, or was it after?
It was pretty much in parallel. I think in fact, the declaration that was the foundation for that treaty was adopted the day before on December 9th, 1948. Okay. So it was also then evolved into a treaty, obviously more narrow, just on the issue of genocide. But that has had a whole history now of international courts, starting with the former Yugoslavia and then Rwanda and Sierra Leone. So I think so much has happened there. I don't know, again, like how much has it affected the reality of the world? But it certainly gives us tools for accountability that I do think, when I was growing up, it was like dictators retired to the Riviera. And now they're worried that they're going to end up in some court, and they should be worried.
Right. I skipped over a question which is to me sort of a fun one, which is what is the most radical one in your head for the time that it was created, in the UDHR in 1948. There were concepts in those 30 articles, and I have a sort of a quote unquote favorite, and you mentioned you had one. So what's that?
So my favorite is Article 24, which reads, everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay, which was one that when I was a student, we used to cite quite frequently. And I was always amused, that it was in there, because I think it shows you that this is a vision of a kind of a life and world that we want to live in. It's not, just one right here, one right there. It's a blueprint for what kind of a world we want to live in, where people have even a right to leisure, which is a part of I think a mental health piece. So I love that one. But honestly, these days, I have to say the fact that this declaration was adopted at all feels very radical. I don't think we could get it today, and it's just great that we have it.
Right. And I just wanted to say that Article 16 to me, because it affects so much, especially women, that men and women of full age without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion have the right to marry and to found a family. And they are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and at its dissolution, which I think must have been, I'm pretty sure with some of the Arab states was a difficult pill to swallow. But all of these you look at, not all of them, but a lot of them you look at and you see the struggles that the drafting committee had and getting through the cultural sort of basically arms crossed in the door kind of reactions to these things, and sort of untangling those things. And ER was considered sort of, when she was chair of the committee, kind of a slave driver. I mean, there were multiple meetings every single day, far into the night, to get this done. So I just want to thank you, Jessica. And now we're, I think, into the Q&A period, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Anna, for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Peyton Clavery. I am the Downstate Outreach Specialist over here at DHR. And we're just going to jump into some Q&A. Hopefully, we have time for a couple. So with the first one, is the inability to enforce the Declaration of Human Rights intentional? And how has this impacted global conflict since World War II?
If that's for me, I would say, intentional, it may not be the word I would choose, but I think it was intentional in the sense that people understood that it was the only way they could get this adopted. I think they wanted something broad and reaching far, and to this day, it's very difficult to get any enforcement mechanisms. So I think that was done on purpose, I guess I would say, more than intentionally, and it was just because of the limitations of the process.
Right. Yeah, I would say that there were just too many conflicts that it would have set up in sort of insurmountable barriers to getting anything done. They would still be sitting there, 3 years after, into 1950 or whatever, trying to get, and you had the intransigence of a lot of sort of regional areas that were just going to say, no, I cannot commit my country to enforceable a declaration. So, it just wasn't practical.
Okay, great. Next question. Is economic justice more important than the USA Bill of Rights?
So is economic justice more important?
Yes, than the United States Bill of Rights.
I would say economic justice is always important, and the Bill of Rights is very important. Economic justice is reflected in a lot of different ways, and in terms of access to work and health care, so I'm not quite sure what, that's a kind of a pretty broad description, because it really encompasses the way we live, how we earn a living, the right to work. Again, I think economic justice even gets into your favorite article, which is the right to leisure, because if you don't have leisure, you can't think about what your next step is going to be. So that's sort of part of, I think there's sort of I would say in two separate baskets.
Well, I think also, as Eleanor Roosevelt and others have said, there's an indivisibility of all these rights. So my question would be to the person who asked the question, why is it either or?
Yeah.
We should have both, and I don't think they're incompatible really in any way. I think they work together, and you can't really fully have one set of those rights without the other.
Okay, great. Next question. In what ways is the Eleanor Roosevelt Center working to support the work of current scholars and legal professionals in the defense and advancement of human rights?
Current scholars and what was that?
Legal professionals.
Legal professionals? Well, we are actually supporting and working on installing, a new program working with high school students. As I mentioned, we had 2 years with the Banned Book Awards, which was basically looking at books that have been banned by various library systems, various communities, and looking at that as basically a restriction and presenting unfair positions for kids who want to read certain books and they're not accessible. So in terms of the legal professions, we don't get involved in that. In the past, we have gotten involved with supporting high school girls from all over countries all over the world in looking at leadership roles and developing their leadership skills, looking at what Eleanor Roosevelt considered as human rights, and getting people to understand, getting young people to understand what their rights were. We've also worked with Dutchess County Community College and other community colleges in the Hudson Valley on leadership skills. So that's what we've done, and that what we are doing is more focused now on local high school groups. So I don't know if that answers that question, because I'm not sure where how they got that information about the legal aspect of that. That is not what we're doing.
Well, that's amazing work that y'all are doing over there. Next question. If you could add a new article to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what would it be and why?
Well, I have an answer. Do you want to go, Jessica, with that?
I said the right to peace. I think, climate justice, peace would be two, if I can add two.
I think for me, access to natural resources is one that I would put in there. Jessica and I had a back and forth a little bit. You thought reference might be to that in the UDHR. It's really not, because when you think about it, back in 48, we didn't think about the effect of burning oil. It's just, we did it. And the fact that then you created highways through poor neighborhoods, and you just, you drained lakes and you used water inefficiently. All of these things impact communities that need those resources. And whether it's here or somewhere else in the world, flood control, for example. I mean, Bangladesh, because of global warming, has constant problems with floods, as other countries do. So I think, environmental justice, as Jessica was saying, but I also think just access to resources is something that is determined by, is really a transgression of human rights, because it puts poor people and struggling communities in an even more difficult position. So that's the one thing I would add.
And I just would, I could, if I could just say one thing about that, I think that, I always look in the Declaration for a place. I mean, obviously it's not spelled out the way you just spelled it out, but often a lot of these things I feel can be sort of shoehorned into Article 25, with the first sentence being, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family. Right. And it doesn't exactly fit, but I mean, I think you could definitely legally argue that the health is affected by all of these things, and you have a right to a certain kind of level of living with health. So that's one area, but of course it's not very explicit.
Yeah, I just think it was not something that people, nobody talked about natural resources or environmental justice until about what, maybe, I don't know, the last 20 years. Environmentalism, yes, way back before then, but it didn't happen really as a movement until sometime, I would say 10, 15 years after Eleanor's death. So that was an evolutionary thing. So.
Great, thank you. Next question. Can you clarify the difficulty in establishing an enforcement body?
It's a political challenge. It's not complicated. It's just that nobody's willing to do it. I mean, I think that's the problem. It's it's just hard enough to even get governments to sign on to these treaties. Our government won't even sign ratify the Women's Convention. So I think it's just a sort of knee-jerk national sovereignty reaction to things international that makes it very difficult. But it's not conceptually difficult at all.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think it does get back to the one of the things you pointed out earlier, that you do, if this needs to get through the Senate, and most of the time you're not going to make that threshold, that 2/3 threshold to get this through. So it's just a question of the U.S. has always been, and Eleanor struggled against this mightily. I think her whole political life is against the tendency of the U.S. to be isolationist, and it comes out in different ways. And this is one of the main ways it comes out is that they sit there, they have how many countries there are now in the UN Assembly, and that's just it's my way or the highway is too often the attitude of the U.S. So.
And remember, too, if you do ratify a treaty in this country, the U.S. Constitution provides the treaties are the law of the land. So it's the highest in terms of its bindingness. It's really the highest level of law that we could have.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question. We've talked about the lack of an enforcement mechanism in the UN, particularly with the rights covered under the UDHR. How do you think we can all individually enforce our rights and the rights of others under the UDHR?
First of all, I would say that it's very important that people read the UDHR and kind of not in a sense of, oh, I have to memorize this, but just to kind of have a basic understanding that you don't have to look at the literal language. There are abbreviated versions of this, so you can kind of get a sense pretty quickly. Look at what is most, important to you as terms of rights that you see are lacking in your community. I mean, Eleanor, in that quote that you were alluding to, Jessica, about where does justice begin in places close to home, this is kind of where comes down often in her philosophy, is that you look at where you are, what are your community's needs? Go back to the UDHR, see how does it express there? And then you take that and you do what you can in your community. Join an organization, write to your congressman, propose legislation through a group that you're a member of. But in essence, her thing was people have to be, democracy, as a lot of people have said, it takes hard work. And that's my main advice is that people are not going to, this is not going to get any better unless we all jump in the pool.
And let me just leave you with two little quick quotes from Eleanor Roosevelt herself. One, she said, well, in the Declaration, there will be provisions which will entail a change of attitude toward the value of the human being as such, and this may require considerable education among our people, but it's a step forward in the conception of civilization throughout the world. I hope when I go home, I can devote myself to action rather than conversation. However, one should never belittle the value of words, for they have a way of getting translated into facts, and therein lies the hope for our Universal Declaration. And then lastly, and most importantly, she said, whenever a violation of human rights, such as discrimination, takes place in areas where it is possible to be corrected Are we on the side of those who fight to do away with discrimination, or are we among those who turn our backs and hope that somebody else will do the disagreeable job of standing up for things we know to be right? And of course, we know that so many times Eleanor Roosevelt stood up for things that were unpopular, and she just did it as a matter of principle. And I think that was, her way of translating these principles into reality.
Right. Very well said. Yeah, I mean, and she was all about working hard and making sacrifices. And I think, she did it with, in terms of the drafting committee, she did this with grace and humor, but also a certain iron hand and a soft glove persistence in getting this done. So kudos to her and all the other members of the drafting committee, which we haven't mentioned, but she worked with some really astounding people. So, and that's another whole subject. So thank you so much, Jessica. I just want to thank Jody.
Thank you.
And everybody who put this together today. This has really been a wonderful opportunity to speak with an expert in these areas. And I might see you up in New York.
I hope so. And again, I'm here broadcasting to you from the home of Eleanor Roosevelt. There is just nothing like it. So come and visit us or go to Val-Kill and just get a firsthand sense of who this woman was.
One point, sorry, Jessica, my mother was born in that house there you're in.
Is that right? Okay,
Yes.
Great. Well, my mother was a Hunter student, and when she was, she's 91 at the moment, and when she was a Hunter student here, she was invited by Eleanor Roosevelt to have tea. But she didn't know how to pour tea, but Eleanor was very nice about it.
Great story. Thank you.
So I want to thank Eleanor Fierst and Jessica Newworth, our speakers today, for really a fascinating discussion about the many aspects of the UDHR and Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy in leading the charge, leading the group of people who came up with that draft. A couple of things that just stuck with me just towards the end that you both mentioned was that many of the causes or the things that were important to her were unpopular. She continued to work hard. She was persistent. And I think that those spoke to me today as important things to remember. I'd like to just share about our next webinar next week, webinar number 2, which will be Wednesday, March 18th at 12 o'clock, titled Human Rights in Action, How the New York State Human Rights Law Protects You. We will have 2 representatives from the New York State Division of Human Rights to talk about what that agency does here in New York in protecting civil rights. I also want to bring your attention to our 3rd educational program in the series. That will be an in-person program at the Family Partnership Center on Wednesday, March 25th, 6 p.m. We are really thrilled to have Anna will be back, and she will be in conversation with the Commissioner of the New York State Division of Human Rights, Denise Miranda. So we are really thrilled about that. So if you have not registered and you're able to attend, please do. We will try, we're working on live streaming it, but we hope you can attend in person if you're able to. I want to thank Peyton and Kelly from the New York State Division of Human Rights. And thank you all today for joining us.
Thank you, Jody. We'll see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.